going to marry him.
From that moment on, my life was ruined.
He has a handsome face. It suits my plan. I'm not denying you the freedom to see your mistresses even after marriage.
You'll know I'm different, and I won't cheat on you.
In a previous life, I married a prince who turned out to be a monster. He abused me and brought contagion from women. Plus, I lost several children to disease. I cut life short by making the prince the first man in history to drive his wife to suicide. Turned out my mission wasn't over.
One day 17 years ago, she will have to marry the most handsome man in the world. When a 6-year-old girl pointed her finger at him, holding that lifeless gaze, his life began to fall apart. She thought all noble families were the same. So, the only thing that caught her eye was his face. Inside, the girl acted so eerily confident that his heart began to beat harder. Her name was Inés Filistina de Perez. She belonged to one of the highest-ranking families of the Grandes de Ortega, an alliance of 17 noble families to whom the emperor had granted peerage titles. And this girl was the one and only daughter of the Duke of Villestena, and the one who rejected the prince of the empire and refused to be a princess. So revered and intelligent could have chosen any of the many suitors, but her choice fell on the heir of Escalante. And the reason was his beauty. Only he should not forget that she didn't like him at all. That's what she said at the time. And yet now Ines was leaving him. But how could he know what his motives were? She had become a sunshine. And now it did not matter so much what sorrow might be hidden in her past or their future, but Carcel would stand here forever waiting for her. He longed for the girl to love him too, as he had loved her all along. So loud clattering was accompanied by the shouts of the heroine. She was asking Lord Carcel to stop, which she actually did. So without turning around, the man listened to her plea for help. The Countess was complaining of extreme dizziness. The girl's cheeks turned pink, but she dared not raise her eyes to him. The stranger did not know what to do, for there were only them, the weak ladies. Her hands were tense as if she were embarrassed or afraid of something, according to her guesses. The Countess was only experiencing simple dizziness, which had happened before. She should have rested in silence for a while, but her residence was on the very outskirts of Mendoza. Suddenly, a shadow hovered over her, causing her to freeze. Lord Carcel smiled and silently watched her while the girl became convinced of his beauty. The son of the greatest noble family in Ortega, and also the most attractive man in Mendoza. The guy called her his lady, causing her to burst out in embarrassment. The girl apologized, continuing to babble about how they weren't expecting a gentleman from whom they could seek help. But not a soul passed by, no matter how long they waited, which was why they were so greatly relieved when he appeared. 3 more female figures could be seen behind her, 2 of whom were supporting the girl who was feeling ill. The Lord put on a satisfied face, as this was indeed an urgent matter. She was honored to know that a gentleman like him was protecting the waters of the empire. The Countess, whom the man carried in his arms, had heard that his grandfather had devoted his life to the service of Ortega, and Lord Carcel had decided to follow in his footsteps. It was also rumored that he wanted to continue the noble work of his family. Upon hearing this, she was quite shocked. After all, the lad was the heir of the Escalante family, and the Nunera Sea was still a dangerous place where battles were fought. But Admiral Calderon's victory was enough to bring peace, but the pirates still caused so much trouble every year. The Lord, on the other hand, being a member of the Grandes de Ortega, had already learned that with his power came great responsibility. His grandfather had always told him that to hold an honorable position, it was necessary to have the willingness and acceptance of that responsibility. The Countess allowed herself to pounce upon him with a kiss, but the man did not respond to it. An alliance of 17 noble families, whom the Ortega imperial family had honored with titles of peerage. But even among them, the Escalante family was considered the best of the best. The heir was a man whose incredible looks were the envy of all. It was as if he was truly blessed by the Almighty. By the time he was 15, Lord Carcel was spending time in the company of all the ladies who had come of age. By 17, he was followed everywhere by admirers, and in 20 he began to get acquainted with more mature and insignificant women. His insatiability knew no bounds even in his youth. Carcel Escalante de Espasa, now aged 23, was in the prime of life. And even now, the lad decided to take advantage of the situation. After all, he hadn't signed up for this, however, it was hard to think about it now. Why had the Lord even agreed? After all, this woman was too easy. The The Countess realized that it was about his fiancé. In her opinion, the girl was not good enough for him. Of course, she had roots in a noble family and she belonged to the House of Valestani after all. Except that she always had such a bored and uninterested look about her. The Countess didn't understand how she could behave like that in front of such a perfect fiancé. It was as if Carcel had had an epiphany, for now he, too, thought it was too much. Being in the arms of this frivolous lady, the guy saw something interesting. Specifically, a girl with a blank stare. She was the one they were talking about. 17 years after the date of betrothal, Inés Valestena de Perez first became aware of his infidelity. Everyone looked at her and whispered, calling Ines a nun. In their eyes, the girl behaved too arrogantly in front of the other noble ladies, and all of them wished to tell Lord Carcel about it. Riding in his carriage, he made sure that she heard these words and was just on his way to the residence of the Duke of Valestena. Once married, a man should not let any woman near him except his wife. However, the Lord already had so many women that he didn't care about that. All the model of family life in high society, when adultery was not frowned upon, was long outdated, and adultery was forbidden even after death. In that case, Carcel planned to have a lot of fun before the wedding. At least since he was destined to spend his life as a monk, he wouldn't have any regrets, and all his dalliances would soon be behind him. The Lord stormed into the room where Inés was sitting. He had no other choice. The girl nodded in greeting, assuming the man had a reason to see her. Even the servants could sense the tense atmosphere. In fact, he had wanted to meet not only yesterday, but 3 days ago as well as 2 weeks ago. Inés explained that it was pouring like a bucket, and she didn't want it to be a problem for him. It was an expected reaction after the scene that presented itself before her. But the girl had never ignored him like that before. Carcel understood how she felt that day. But mentally, he still blamed her for the fact that he would have to live the rest of his life like a monk. However, Inés pretended not to understand what he was trying to say. She had changed his life with the flick of a finger, so to call this woman submissive would not turn her tongue. But Carcel felt that Inés Valestena loved him. She had chosen him for love, giving up the highest title and the legal right to marry a member of the imperial family. She had had plenty of opportunities to make things right, but she had missed them all. 17 years ago, or now, doesn't matter because the heroine waited out of love, still in the same place. But that had always been the problem. The girl had the feeling, yet Carcel didn't share it one bit, causing the guilt to constantly torment him. He wanted to explain everything, but Inés had seen it with his own eyes, so that was enough. And if she got it right, there was nothing scary about it. That was exactly what the man was surprised about. He became unlike himself, losing any confidence, because the girl didn't even yell at him. Inés wasn't even upset, though. Carcel denied it, referring to the fact that she had refused to see him for 2 weeks. As it turned out, the girl didn't want that because of the rain, since her fiancé might get wet on the way here. Of course, she found such bickering very tiresome. They weren't close enough to have this kind of dialogue, and this was not about 1 or 2 women with whom Carcel had had an affair. Did he really think she didn't know about anything? Inés was not angry, as the Lord was free to be with whomever he wished. He couldn't get his head around it. After all, they were supposed to have a wedding soon. It didn't mean to her that they should lose their freedom right now, though. Moreover, they weren't married yet, so Inés would let him do as he pleased. The guy thought it was a joke. However, she wasn't saying all this because she was so understanding. The girl did not limit him in his actions because Carcel was indifferent to her. His heart began to pound frantically, which made that horrible sound in his ears. That summer, he turned 23. That's when she told him that everything he believed was a lie. As a little boy, Carcel asked how many years equaled life, which made everyone laugh. He was annoyed at this until suddenly someone behind his back asked him if he knew the meaning of the word. It was Inés, who already recognized the answer. The kid was embarrassed, but still kept saying that he knew everything. The girl asked for an explanation, but he lowered his head and blanched. The little girl rushed sharply to the man whose full copy she was, and wanted to know if she really had to talk to this Lord Carcel. Hay, on the other hand, had sweat beading on his face, as if he were nervous. Inés was much smarter than her peers, and this she understood perfectly well. It was Duke Lionel Valestena. The man proceeded to moralize that the girl should not ignore those who were not as smart as she was. Carcel, on the other hand, seemed to think they thought he was a dullard. However, the girl didn't need friends, and besides, the Lord was her fiancé, not her friend. The Duke sighed heavily, trying to get the idea into her head that Inés should have been even kinder to him. However, the The girl was indeed bright, for she realized the badness of her character. But even so, she was still a lady. Eanes turned sharply to Carcel, which made the boy shiver. She explained that only a dead man could answer him how long life had been. The lad turned white altogether, deciding that dead people could talk. However, that was not the case. For that reason, none of the living knew the answer. The dead man knew it because he had gone through death. However, Carcel had learned of it about 4 months ago. Life was the time they had before death, so when a person died, it would end. Even so, the Lord could count and know how long his life would last. The lad wallowed in his world of thoughts, wondering how he would die. His grandfather's leg began to corrode me after he was shot in Nuniera. Did that mean he would lose his leg too, or something? Ines mumbled that his grandfather had lived over a decade since he lost his leg. Now Carcel was confused at all. He was afraid that he would have to share the same fate, and if not, then he would have to marry her. His tears were dripping off his red face, but even so, the guy was awfully cute. Everyone was bantering and trying to figure out what had happened, while Ines freaked him out more by mentioning that they would have to make a baby as well. The truth was that it might not last a lifetime. A smile lit up her face at that phrase. She was talking about their marriage, and now they could raise their glasses to Carcel Escalante de Esposa and Ines Valentina de Perez, who would be married upon reaching adulthood. Thanks to this beautiful couple that has been together all their lives, the union between the two families will only be strengthened. Spins will become the lady of the Escalante family, and Carcel will become the son-in-law of the Valestena family. And to the joy of the imperial family, they will devote themselves to each other for the rest of their lives. It was from that day on that his life began to fall apart. Someone still couldn't understand why it was him. It was Oscar Valenza de Ortega, crown prince and cousin of Carcel. The guy looked at the little guy who didn't understand anything. Oscar asked him to strain his meanderings and try harder. When he grew up and became emperor, would Carcel also stare at him in response to his question? It seemed to him that the Lord had done something to Lady Valestena, even though he was only 6 years old. That was what it was all about. How dare a 6-year-old cousin be so devious? He'd only just turned 10 himself. Oscar called the girl his. He couldn't accept that Carcel had dared to steal his master's property. The boy sizzled him with his angry gaze. Oscar would not punish him, however, since the Lord was his uncle's son, but it was assumed that their alliance would be for the good of the imperial family. When Ines refused the crown prince's offer and chose Carcel instead, it was Empress Cayetana who brought him to the girl as if she had been waiting for it. She never once asked the little girl why she had defiantly refused the emperor's son. On the contrary, in letters, the woman kindly persuaded her to make her own choice. Cayetana was supposed to maintain an alliance with House Valestina, but she certainly did not favor the sullen girl. The empress needed Ines, but did not believe she was worthy of her son. Oscar knew she had turned him down and chosen a fool like Carcel, though the Lord himself thought the crown prince liked the girl, for he wanted her so much. The guy called Ines a crow and laughed, since the desire to possess and sympathy are two different things. Oscar wanted to marry her, but that didn't mean he loved her. It just so happened that her bloodline was best suited for marriage. Either way, he wanted to visit this crow. There was still plenty of time before they would grow up, and when the meeting took place, Oscar was brimming with pomp and cunning, and, in contrast, Carcel was devastated. In fact, it seemed to him that the girl hated the crown prince with all her soul, which Oscar was immediately able to sense. He definitely had a knack for picking up negative energy. Ines explained that it was customary to give at least a week's notice of a visit, but it seemed that His Highness had considered a visit to her estate such an extraordinary convenience that he had left proper etiquette unheeded, and as a result, they had failed to receive her as befitted. Oscar had said that an apology between them was unnecessary. However, she was still not prepared for the visit, much to her embarrassment. The crown prince shot his eyes up, repeating that there was no need to prepare anything. He didn't come to see the duke or duchess, but her. The kid didn't seem to catch on to what she was talking about at all. Ines thought the meeting would have gone much better if the time had been right. Carcel wondered how he could ignore her words so much. His Highness wanted to chat about the book she had provided, which he had reread a few days ago. His love for books was a serious problem for him, as he lacked time at times to learn how to run the empire. Ines decided that she should not have advised him about the book. Oscar, on the other hand, said it was nonsense because discussing these informative topics with her was always one pleasure. After all, the existence of intellectuals like them can be so lonely. They forever have to put up with the ignorance of the masses. What he was saying was truly ridiculous. However, whenever Oscar saw Ines, he felt like he could finally breathe. Most likely, Carcel had yet to experience the pain experienced by people like them. The Crown Prince had told her that it would be hard for a girl to meet someone of equal intelligence other than himself, so there was no risk involved. He gave her the chance to make the right decision. In the name of the imperial family Ortega, Oscar asked her to marry him. However, she didn't like the guy one bit. These words made him freeze as he continued to listen. It was for this reason that she refused him. He was overwhelmed by the anger that was accumulating in his clenched fists. Oscar wanted to know the reason, but suddenly Ines asked Carcel to come to her because he was her fiancé and therefore had to protect her. However, the Crown Prince did not want his intervention. The heroine continued to talk to the Lord, alluding to the inconvenience the Crown Prince had caused her. Oscar, on the other hand, believed that this had nothing to do with the children, since the negotiations were conducted by adults. But he did not consider the fact that Lady Ines was 6 years old. However, she was nothing like Carcel. The guy made a spectacle of the difference between want and like, but he did seem to like the girl. The little girl hid behind her fiancé's back, which caused a violent reaction from both of them. Now, Oscar guessed what kind of game his cousin was thinking about. The Crown Prince thought the Lord intended to disrespect him. He had warned him, after all. He wanted to believe that Ines didn't mean it, as if she found herself unworthy, for the lad would one day rule an entire empire. However, the protagonist had heard enough. His Highness would not give up, for he wished she would endow him with wings, and then they would both rule Ortega. His shouts gave her a headache, but Carcel still continued to stand in a stupor. The boy wished he could stop this torment because he no longer wanted to come between them. Except as Ines had prompted him, Carcel was only 6 years old, so he didn't have a master yet. Probably that was the impetus to take her by the hand and drag her away. The children ran out of the room, but when he inquired if her headache had gone away, the heroine explained that it was an obvious lie. Still remained in prostration, for it now seemed to him that Ines had no fear of death and had therefore lied to the Crown Prince. However, even the imperial family would not dishonor itself by reprimanding the house of Valentina on such an occasion. The Lord had no idea why his cousin liked such a girl. She was a brute, not even in appearance. Maybe a little Ines was cute, but even so he was too good for her. The heroine took a rag and wiped Escalante's hands, making him as red as a tomato. 3 minutes later, he felt like he had been treated like a fool. Carcel noticed that she had not previously called him Escalante. As it turned out, Ines thought he hated her. However, that was not the case. But then why was the Lord crying? He had roared again when the girl had said they would have to live together until death do them part, and how Carcel had cried after her words about having a child. Now the boy was begging her to stop. He didn't understand the reason he was so embarrassed. Ines had agreed to call him by his first name. He'd never had anyone treat him like that in his entire life. She was the only one. Carcel, on the other hand, thought she was strange. After all, Ines liked him. At least that was what they said. But if it were true, she wouldn't have acted that way with him. The boy doubted her sincerity, but otherwise the heroine would not have dared to marry him. Rumors swarmed around Ines according to which she did not understand that to choose her chosen prince was the greatest honor, and that the girl pointed to Carcel because of his pretty face. However, that was the case. She didn't even deny it. The lad was even numb, as if he dreaded it, but would there be anyone who wouldn't like anything cute? Especially when the face could be put to good use. All of those words indicated to him what Ines's opinion of people was. She said she liked him, and yet she was so rude. Didn't she want to impress him? The heroine didn't think long, as she didn't think she lacked anything to do so. However, Ines didn't agree with the idea that in order for someone to like you, you have to change yourself. Her confidence was reflected even in her posture. Carcel didn't have to like her at all. She didn't need to be, but he would only have to remember that she liked him very, very much. And now, as an adult, the protagonist was saying that she wasn't interested in Escalante. That's when he realized that there was something wrong here. The guy wondered, had her feelings for him really changed? She'd always been rather modest, and therefore if she expressed affection, it was through letters, but her devotion had long been known to the whole of high society. Even this room was still the same. Nothing had changed in all the years. But there was something here, and Carcel was convinced of it. Something that could explain the change in her feelings. If I may say so, it's a clue. Was it possible that the reason was that she was uncomfortable because their bodies had changed? Or did it all happen before he entered the military academy? No, even when disapproving looks were thrown at Ines, she always acted so coldly accurate. At least she had stopped calling him Lord like she had last time. Thought something in this room had clearly changed. Not even that shapeless. Funeral dress could hide the fact that her body's newfound maturity was beautiful. The girl noticed that he was thinking about obscenities again, though for him that would be his only pleasure. Carcel asked why she was not interested in him. But there was no hidden meaning here, so he could care less. Clearly that wasn't the best answer. Ines explained that she had only given it to make him feel better. She said that she knew all about his personal adventures, that he didn't need to worry about her, and so Carcel was free to do whatever he wanted. It all made sense now. He had upset her, and that was why his fiancé was being so sarcastic, even though she had no idea what Carcel was talking about. Lord tried to explain that either that was the case, or she had said those words without actually putting that meaning in. It even seemed to him that Ines was concerned about his feelings. The guy himself didn't realize he was talking nonsense. He acted as if the girl had found another man or something like that. Carcel even asked if that was the case, and the answer was not unequivocal. Ines was nobody's desired quiet girl, just as his cousin had once said, the crow of the house of Valestena. However, the reason men hovered around her was because she already had an extremely attractive fiancé. Ines always dressed similarly, so it was no wonder she remained in the shadows. In a sea of lively birds, the heroine stood out like a crow, but with a body like that, she could win over even the silliest nobleman. But the truth is what she is. Carcel couldn't say that she was beautiful just because of her body. The girl declared that women were interested in him because her looks were much less threatening compared to his. She had no complaints about this marriage or him. Nor was there any point in ruining their relationship over such nonsense. He was born to be her husband. It seemed to the man that she was not all right in her mind, though Ines was more than sane. She knew exactly what jealousy was like, and she also knew how to be angry, as well as how to feel affection. That's why the protagonist threatened to kill him if he betrayed her. That was what her love for the man made her, and for that reason she didn't want to waste her energy on someone like him. Someone she didn't even like. There was something else Carcel wished to say to her, but she had had enough. He grabbed her arm insolently, demanding that she listen to him. Ines continued to refuse, causing his anger and irritation to grow. Though the Lord himself didn't understand why he was doing this, or why he was holding her wrist. And how had things gotten so dramatic? Tears began to stream down her face. What was she supposed to think? How was she supposed to understand his relationship with that woman? Carcel froze like a stone, repeating her words in his head. What really surprised him was the expression on his fiancé's face. He put his arm around her shoulders, reassuring her that nothing had happened between them. That couldn't be true. The man pulled her against him, holding deep eye contact and calling her the only one who mattered to him. Carcel himself couldn't believe he had said it. Ines continued to cry, forcing herself not to believe his words. His strong arms pushed her body against his until they both felt something. The protagonist pulled away sharply, trying to break free from his tenacious grasp. She was not willing to take any more of these insults. Now, in her eyes, the groom was horrible and disgusting, but even now this lecture kept her close to him. How it hurt him. Ines switched to abusive language, but according to him, his body wouldn't have reacted that way if there had been another in his arms. She was the only one that caused such a reaction in him. Now there was a need to end it all. Carcel had told her his secret. He felt this way, only toward her. There was a long silence in the room. The man mentioned that he would let her go if she trusted him. In that case, what could Ines do? Her dark curls flowed down her narrow shoulders, which became bare in an instant. Lord had only to show how much he desired her. The girl never wore underwear when she went to meet him, each time hoping that one day he would take her into his arms and get to know her body more intimately. She had waited so long for this, that it seemed like a dream now, just a harmless dream without suffering or sorrow. A dream in which Ines is exposed and so he would never want to wake up from it. Except it all turned out to be fiction. He was awakened by his little copy, which reminded his brother of sparring. The man thought back to her words. Now he was convinced he could live the life he wanted to live. Because his fiancée didn't care one bit, and come to think of it, Carcel also blamed her for today's incident. In fact, the Lord was even glad that it came out this way, and he seemed to have become the happiest person in the world. The captain, as he was addressed, had been repeating the same words since his arrival, constantly referring to his chastity. The man had simply never heard Carcel speak so much, which meant he was satisfied with what she had told him. He should have made for a long tongue, however, because the bullet was moving very fast. He didn't even know how to shoot properly and he was already criticizing his captain. In fact, the guy envied the Lord. That is, it was every man's dream. Namely, a wife who didn't restrain her husband. When a man gets married, he will be forced to live under the constant supervision of his partner. That's when they cease to be free. Did he really think Carcel was such a scumbag? All the man said was that he was lucky to have as a bride such a caring and kind lady who was willing to let her husband live the life he wanted. Except that, in the Lord's own opinion, this woman showed no care for him. In fact, Inez didn't give a damn about him. That is why she will be fine whatever Carcel does. Once again, the captain was approached by a lady who was only too glad for his long vacation. She was thrilled to be able to watch him all summer. God had endowed Carcel with a beautiful face and such a strong and perfect body, which made the girl envy his bride. And only he was able to turn her on like that. For some reason, the man froze and suddenly asked this lady to move away from him. Of course, she was returning, because this night he was to be hers, but the Lord still left her alone. There was some nonsense going on in his head. Escalante had thought that those speeches were more than just nonsense, but now he had doubts. The words spoken in his dream had no power over him. So why was this happening? Why didn't Carcel get excited being with such a lady? After the wedding, he wouldn't have any other options besides ends, so he shouldn't be deprived of doing this. It must be some kind of curse, or maybe it's just a temporary malfunction. Lord believed that he had zero chance at that age of fitting in as impotent. Now he tried to reassure himself, but that very night, as soon as he thought of Ines, the problem resolved itself. That's how his self-belief worked. It was alright because Inez wouldn't have to go tonight anyway. How wrong Carcel had been. The bride apologized for being late, but the man was at a loss for words. The girl practically did not show up at such events, even despite the invitations. While everyone was whispering about her, Inez knew that her fiancé would show up here. Her bare hand touched his tense cheek. She asked him not to make such a facial expression, which was devoid of any nobility, in public. Who was responsible for it, though? An awkwardness hung between them. The silence was interrupted by the protagonist, who apologized for the incident. She wasn't quite sure she knew the reason, but it seemed that what had happened had thrown him off balance a bit. Had Inez really come here to see him at a different time? Though the girl didn't think a separate reason was necessary for a simple meeting. Had she upset him again? Her excessive politeness was unnecessary, for Carcel found it both an inconvenience and a cause for concern. Ines leaned closer, sensing how irritable he was today. Such proximity made the man flush and blush. But she noticed that, as of late, the Lord had been acting awfully strange. By the time Carcel came to his senses, he was already in the carriage. It even seemed to his fiancée that the guy was somehow unhinged. However, the Lord himself did not understand why he behaved like that. After all, he did not consider himself some kind of pervert or a teenager with raging hormones. It's even suggested that he get out of the carriage if he came to his senses, especially when they were already at his house. The girl made a displeased look on her face as she mentioned that they were going to the Escalante residence. The need to see her was not something that pleased him too much. The protagonist understood that, but if her fiancé continued to behave like this, it would turn into a problem for her as well. But she was well aware that he didn't think she was annoying. Carcel helped her out of the carriage, after which Ines leaned on his arm, which was a very painful torture for him. He sat her down across from him, which made her feel the space was too open for conversation. They had something personal to discuss, but the man felt this room was private enough so they could begin. The last time Carcel had left in such a hurry that it had not been possible to finish the conversation there, though he himself had denied it. Ines appreciated the effort her fiancé had made to hide the truth from her. In particular, she spoke of his efforts to keep his salacious lifestyle a secret. She knew he was doing it out of respect for her. Carcel had decided to keep his mouth shut since the blame was on him. He was now convinced that the bride was crazy about him, except she wasn't done yet. What the protagonist meant was that he didn't need to worry and hide who he was dating, because she had no interest in him, just like he had no interest in her. For the remainder of the engagement, they can just keep it that way and stay out of each other's personal lives, and then stick to that after the wedding. As long as no one disrespects the other outright, they will indulge each other and stay out of personal matters. Carcel tried to make sure that what he heard was correct and as if asking for permission to do whatever he wanted on his own time. As if the girl intended to do something behind his back. He jumped up and moved closer to her, sitting down on the table. Inez reminded him that people don't behave that way. However, the guy defiantly replied that he wouldn't be a toad by sitting on the table. Carcel explained that before calling him a child, Then she should have thought about what nonsense she was talking about. It appeared that Ines had put on this whole show for the sake of her lover. He asked her that question again, for it would explain everything. Why she didn't care about his misdeeds, why she let him do whatever he wanted, and why she went so far. Who knows, it might have been more than one man. Escalante couldn't imagine how many men the protagonist could seduce with her porcelain skin and sensual body. Given her personality and the way she commanded, the girl could definitely take control of anyone. But after the wedding, Ines refuted his speculation. The only reason she suggested it was to make things easier for him. She wanted the groom to be free. After all, his life had changed because of her. Carcel had caved into her without wanting it to. He had to become heir to the house again because of her. They should have gotten married 6 more years ago, but Carcel had enrolled in the military academy, only to postpone the wedding. By doing so, though, he'd only done her a favor. It wasn't that Ines hated him. It was just that it hurt to postpone the wedding. She was sure it meant nothing to him. It was that phrase that caused him to have an internal contradiction. It's in her eyes. Carcel boarded a warship and went into battle only to postpone a life together with his nun-like fiancé. There was no point. His heart began to beat rapidly, for there definitely had to be some ulterior motive here. Over the past 17 years, the man had seen her from all sides. But she was only going to be his wife, in fact, going to lead her life apart from him. Carcel practically nestled into her face, looking into her eyes, summarizing all of her words. Did she really think that was possible? Escalante reached up to kiss her, causing her hands to shake. Hadn't the girl said they should have children? What about sharing in the process of conceiving them? He was sorry to ruin her plans, but they would not live apart. She would have to kiss him hundreds of times and their bodies would meet thousands of times. Carcel had promised not to lay a finger on any other woman, being by her side when she gave birth to her firstborn, and then the next. And even if they don't make babies, he will make sure that he will satisfy her. He would make sure his wife would do the opposite, because he didn't want his so-called freedom or privacy. His understanding of marriage ruled that out. Even though the protagonist thought he was a disgusting bastard, even so he was more faithful than Ines. The story of the protagonist herself was different from her point of view. Ida's first life was cut short when she was 26 years old. The length of life was known only to the dead, which was how she came to know the length of her own. The girl knew the answer as she had died before, but the source of the knowledge she gained was not only death. After all, the end of her first life was 26 years. It was the result of her own decisions, and no one else's. It had also happened a long time ago, but the sense of hopelessness experienced then was still fresh in her mind. She remembered the last thing she had seen was the dorky look on the prince's face, and the chaos that had ensued at 26. The one and only daughter of the Duke of Valestena had achieved her status by belonging to the Grandes de Ortega. She was born into one of the strongest families in the empire and was a lady who enjoyed extravagant jewelry. For the sake of satisfying his daughter's fine tastes, the Duke spared no expense, and this led to Ines becoming a permanent leader in fashion in the city of Mendoza. At the time, noble women applied an almost poisonous powder to their skin on a regular basis to make it pale, but soon after the protagonist returned from a summer trip with skin, the shade of bronze, tanning gained popularity. Ines truly lived a social life. Magazines were busy weekly glorifying the Crown Prince's bride for her dignity. She was beloved by the Crown Prince and lived like a beautiful young princess. At that time, Ines was so happy in her perfect life that she made an effort to make it even more perfect. The girl exhausted her dressmakers to create new dresses and studied a lot of invitations to decide which events would not only improve her reputation, but also allow her to become the center of attention. In pursuit of a slim waist, Ines starved herself, but wanted those around her to believe that she was born that way, so she made a spectacle of eating large portions of food when attending formal dinners. Afterward, however, the protagonist was nausea-inducing. Was she living a normal life? Ines wasn't sure about that. That's when doubts began to grow in her. She couldn't tell if it was for the sake of becoming the perfect wife, or if she was simply using him to gain that. But Ines did love him. Loved him, even if it had only been a few years, and the girl had fallen for his vile lies. And the reasons for her love were rooted in her own vanity, and she really loved reputation and status. How could it be love? How could she have this light feeling for someone like him? The girl had suffered 4 miscarriages, and whenever she lost a child, the imperial family and the empress blamed her for it, exercising scorn and attacks. This is how Ines lived for 10 years. Oscar never once took her side and ignored her pleas for comfort. In fact, he even came to the conclusion that his wife had been born into the world with a cursed womb. Although her life seemed dazzling from the outside, the protagonist was dying inside. After her marriage, it was hard to call her life normal. As a result, when Ines found out that her not one bit spoiled spouse had contracted every possible disease due to his promiscuous lifestyle, and that it was the cause of death of all 4 children, when she was tormented by the memories of all those horrible nights when her vile husband had taken her, pregnant by force, ignoring her attempt to refuse him, solely to satisfy himself. He was the only man she'd ever known, and now her body was tainted with proof of all the lewd nights Oscar had spent with other women. Ines had done nothing shameful in her life, but she was still being punished for marrying a human likeness, a freak. But there was something worse than the illnesses he endured, his desire to. He was well aware of this, but he had never once hesitated to satisfy himself at the expense of his unassuming wife. Whether it was his wife or the conception of an heir was of no concern to him. He didn't even do it to annoy her. Oscar simply didn't give it a second thought. When she looked back on her life, she counted 4 miscarriages as a blessing. If even one baby struck out, the sin would be irreversible. Her mind had never been clearer. The fact that she had not produced a single child was her only consolation. Oscar had said that no one in his lineage had ever been divorced before, that he couldn't be the first loser in the imperial family, so now she is going to change that. He was going to be the very first prince to drive his wife to self-destruction. Ines was going to do it because living with him made her disgusted, and she couldn't spend another minute with someone like him. Just like that. The protagonist left a bloody mark on his life. No one could have come up with a more peaceful outcome, for her death did not cause harm to a single soul, not even the crown prince, who was little better than a drain rat. If he had suffered from anything, it was Ines' will, in which she had revealed all the details of his sordid sexual escapades. She didn't expect to receive any compensation. She just hoped that if there was a god, she'd be lucky enough to be in a better place. And on that, the protagonist closed her eyes, determining for herself that it wouldn't change her mind. And so, waking up on the hunting grounds where she spent her childhood, Ines had no idea what had happened. She shifted to a run, breathing in the fresh air and looking around the green expanse as the wind played with her dark hair. The boy, an exact replica of her, didn't understand what had gotten into her. Ines, on the other hand, was crying because she felt the pain. This was her dream. He was still so young. Who would have thought that the great Luciano Valestena was a brat in his 19 years? The protagonist's older brother looked back at her warily as she did it again. The girl was acting very strange today. Perhaps Ines had mistakenly taken her mother's medicine, although the servants thought that the reason was because of the upcoming wedding. Luciano agreed with this position, except that she herself said that she could not wait for this event. Juana was also young and beautiful in her eyes. She had just turned 17 this year. Her brother tried to stop her, for she sounded like a perverted old man lusting after young girls. Her whole life at Perez ended when she turned 16, the moment he threw the veil over her head. From then on, Ines couldn't go back for the rest of her life. And those who were dear to her, the beautiful garden where she played with Luciano, and that place at the top of the castle, all became a memory. Ines had no idea how things were here, how the people she had left behind had changed. But now it all appeared before her again, just as it had before. All of last spring, the protagonist spent here in Perez. That was 10 years ago. Still that time of year in Balistan, and now she was realizing that spring wasn't over yet. Luciano announced that in 4 months, she would be married to the crown prince, and in 2 weeks the girl would be leaving for Mendoza. Everyone in this place will be looking for faults in her. After all, Prince Oscar was already too good for her. Her brother understood that her sister was feeling the pressure, however. Ines interrogated him about who else was too good for whom. It was like she was having a tantrum. The girl jumped on Luciano and started hitting him. It all seemed too true to be real. But at her 26, the protagonist's life was already so hopeless. She had been naive at 16 when she dreamed of being Oscar's wife, but none of it was a dream. Ines went back to the time when she was 16, and the wedding was 4 months away, so her life hadn't fallen apart yet. She was rewarded for her patience. This was her chance to kill herself properly before she could go to heaven. At least, that was what Ines had piously believed at the time, back then when she had first experienced death. They had been engaged for 10 years, and the wedding was just around the corner, so the girl knew what kind of reaction to expect. At that moment, Oscar was practically a saint. Cold to the mind and sober of mind. He was the crown prince for keeping his chastity to share it with his bride on their wedding night. Who would believe it if she told him that 2 years later he would be frequenting brothels, and he'd be infected with venereal disease? There was no need to waste this precious opportunity on a futile struggle. Ines didn't want to marry Oscar again. And to prevent that from happening, she should have been more cunning. There were rumors that the mistress was in love with a portrait painter, but she was underage, and the man was extremely handsome. So what happened to the woman who had obediently agreed to such an honorable marriage and stayed with him? She felt that love could overshadow a failed marriage in her first life. And when true love burst into her life, the protagonist was swept up in it in an instant. It was this man who showered her with compliments while lying beneath her. From the moment he first saw her, he always knew he would be helpless. He would never be able to stop falling in love with her, making even tears run down his face. His name was Emiliano. The 16-year-old girl had disappeared from Perez with him, and even though they were penniless, she had lived a happy life together for 4 years, until her older brother found them. Emiliano managed to escape for a while with the help of another man, but it ended with him returning on his own 2 feet to die in front of her. The Duke of Valestina's daughter had run away with that poor man, only to return as a child. It was a shame, but fortunately the Empress was so merciful. Luciano should have kept a close eye on her. They had to make sure her wedding to the Count Almenara went smoothly, and as for the offspring she gave birth to, they wanted to get rid of him. And the older brother promised to take care of him. The main character, all the while eavesdropping on this, didn't want her child to feel pain in a strange place. Sometimes one single name could change the whole world. His name was Emiliano. He was the only color in her world that consisted of only black and white. Now she begged him not to forget her. The man who had changed her world could no longer exist in it. It was a perfectly thought-out plan. The protagonist had even chosen a handsome man to marry so that he would cheat on her. All of this was done in order to become the wife of Duke Escalante, who by chance does not live with him. Carcel considered himself more faithful than her, and therefore, the guy would never betray his own family. In real life, Ines pondered whether she had done something wrong. What mistake had she made? Her plan had been 17 years in the making, so it couldn't just fall apart. Then why was Carcel betraying her? At last, this lady's man had decided to settle down. Yesterday, he even sent a letter asking for Madame's hand in marriage. Only it was his desire that was the problem. Juana didn't quite understand her train of thought, but the lieutenant was perfect. He was only guilty of being a womanizer, but he had made a promise to work on his behavior. However, Ines had heard it 1,000 times, and she didn't want to hear it from her. In her youth, The protagonist had had tender feelings for this man, but now she didn't even want to hear it. And she didn't even want to hear it, and she didn't have much oil on her feet at all. Her mistress hated having it on her feet. Juana noticed that this was the first time she had ever done this for her, so how could she know? The protagonist abruptly changed the subject, admitting that she was fond of the current Escalante. The girl even suggested that her mistress enjoyed watching him flirt with other women, and that look. Her fiancé had said he didn't need it. Perhaps he had said a phrase or two to placate her before the wedding. But still, he was a soldier, so he was unlikely to make such statements so easily. Ines, on the other hand, thought that everyone was lying. Soldiers lie to their superiors all the time. Even the priests in whom Juana had such faith must have lied from time to time. But she was right about one thing. After all, Escalante had only said such a thing to please her. He was simply weaving what he could. Carcel could never change. A feline can't suddenly become a man. If a dog says how he'll turn human tomorrow, will he? The lady was talking to herself again. Ines was not wrong, so her efforts would not be in vain. Someone had gotten all the information. Why did he always act so suspicious? Carcel pushed him away when the man talked about confidential information. Ines really didn't have anyone. The lady was well known for her decency and chastity, which was why the cat had told him there was no way she had a man. And according to the mouse, her position allowed her to keep an eye on all the private visitors to the Valestena family residence, and she told. Escalante's head was already boiling with these nicknames. But still, he wondered who this man was. Carcel only wanted to know his identity, and perhaps, if possible, to see him in person. The girl wore a mask of indifference, as if she wouldn't shed a drop of blood if she hurt herself, but he wondered if she had ever shown a bright smile to anyone else. The lady's reputation was impeccable, from her demeanor to her way of being, perfect in everything. Except the speaker had gotten this information from people belonging to her family. As it became known, the surveillance was his first time, as well as the lieutenant's. What he was doing, Carcel couldn't believe it himself. As it was, he already felt that he had committed almost the crime of the century by ordering his subordinate to spy on his fiancée. Of course, at the end of this pathetic enterprise, his subordinate had gotten the information much more quickly than he had anticipated. But, as expected, it was nothing special. And the answer was obvious. So why did the protagonist feel relieved? Is it possible that his fiancée is just incredibly meticulous? Jose heard all the maids laughing at the idea. They said she saw men as gnats. Moreover, the man had asked around, but no one had said anything to cause concern. Yes, and it was as if the women Carcel had met in the past had made their own checks on the lady, hoping to find her weak spot. For some reason, the maids seemed to be no strangers to answering such questions. Jose had no idea how often those ladies had been questioned, since his investigation hadn't aroused suspicion. But Ines Valestina had unfriended his very nature. The man had no idea that such a thing could be going on behind his back. These women were looking for flaws in his fiancée, whom he didn't even love, planned to use it against her. Who to blame but himself? It's his face. But it won't happen again. Josie wondered if the lieutenant had sent back the letter of request for marriage, but what would he do if there was a weakness? The lad decided that the gentleman intended to break the engagement, but a promise is a promise, especially when marriage was involved. Carcel exhaled and explained that he would not consider it a bad thing if she had a man. After all, he had had many women himself. It would be unreasonable of him to say that he couldn't get married because he suspected his fiancée of having affairs on the side. In addition, whether he wanted the marriage or not, from the age of 6 until now, the man had never once considered a life in which he was not married to Ines. Carcel intended to return to Kalstala after the wedding, which would take place within the next 2 weeks. It was the longest vacation he could get this summer. Jose would also have to return, so he had to use up all of his vacation time. including winter vacation time. A dinner was held at the Valestina family residence when the wedding was 10 days away. The Duke, on the other hand, sizzled Carcel with his gaze, as he had heard that he had kept a quiet lifestyle. Given that his antics were known all over Mendoza, he was a deaf man. Luciano was in agreement. How nervous Carcel was. He explained that he couldn't think clearly, which made the Duke think that the guy wasn't thinking at all. All this time he had assumed that Escalante was a simple traitor, but it seems that nature had deprived him of brains as well. If the lack of a benefactor was considered a talent, then he would definitely be the greatest genius. How could such a fool even consider himself worthy of his daughter's hand in marriage? Carcel, on the other hand, was covered with cold sweat. If he were to officially take Ines as his wife, he would do everything he could not to disappoint his lordship. However, the man was disappointed by his mere presence. The protagonist herself was silently observing the situation while sharing her meal. The Duke had been watching the lad all evening, and it gave him agony to see him breathing. Suddenly, Ines pounded on the table, demanding that everything stop, especially when her father himself had invited a guest. The Duke literally flamed at his daughter's reaction, which remained casual. Lionel could have easily cracked his skull open, but he didn't. He had even changed his plans to give him a proper dinner. Previously, the man had done nothing only because of his behavior. This small man just shouted that he was not going to take her as a wife. Rumor had it so, but in fact, they were getting married, so Ines asked to leave Carcel alone. The boy himself could not believe that her mother drank so much strong alcohol in such a situation. It seemed to her that no one had eaten much that evening, and she was the only one enjoying the meal. Lionel was even more angry when Carcel deigned to speak. He had not said a single flattering word to his future wife all evening. According to the Duke, Escalante could tell that she was especially beautiful tonight, that the dress paled in comparison to her beauty. It was for this reason that the Lord spoke sharply of the fact that Ines was already beautiful. The girl's father raged at the words of one who sold his body for a penny, for he would not tolerate his daughter being neglected. Before her years of youth were gone, they had decided to show up here with the intention of getting married before the 2 weeks were up. He had even gotten the idea that Carcel had caught a venereal disease and was about to give up, and now he was being told to get an heir. In his eyes, the boy was nothing to his daughter. Yes, and Ines couldn't take it anymore. She gave her father a cold stare, for it was not right to treat a guest like that. Lord Carcel was respected in the Imperial Navy and didn't trade his body or steal anything. Of course, there were plenty of flaws in him that one could criticize without distorting the truth. The Duke of Valestina had reason to do so. After all, his daughter was not getting any younger with the years. But the man still did not understand why she was bringing the marriage to an end. Her fiancé had denied the wedding plans and sailed the seas, so his anger was expected. But Carcel had no idea her family would oppose the marriage so strongly. That their engagement had not yet been broken off was astounding. What followed was a suggestion to hang on again. Now then, the protagonist understood why the Duke had never once objected, while he kept finding excuses to delay the wedding. This was what he wanted. Ines was long past the age of consent in Ortega, and since she bore the surname of Valestina, there should have been no problem in receiving marriage proposals from other worthy families. This engagement existed to this day, not to mention that neither Valestina nor Escalante are ordinary noble families, so they didn't judge anything lightly. Even though Carcel might not like the girl, or even be interested in her, she at least wanted him. Today he realized something. Ines' smile was most beautiful when she was lying. That was why the girl had confessed her love for him in front of everyone. Her mother's opinion was different from the Duke's statement, because she liked him originally. Ines, too, had always said that he was sickeningly good for her. Now Carcel was getting annoyed when Miguel walked so close to her. The woman was already drunk, but she still demanded his attention. She admitted that she wanted a daughter different from Ines. Decisively, all her actions brought disappointment. Clearly, she hadn't always been like this. The girl had changed when one day she came down with a terrible fever. Since then, she had been disappointing her with everything she did. Even now, the protagonist looked like a witch. Would Carcel be able to bear living with her? The man himself, however, thought she was quite beautiful. Her mother saw that he resisted it, and therefore made every effort to postpone the wedding. Even the thought of it horrified him. She was hardly indignant either. The mother asked Carcel to rectify her own daughter, who, in her eyes, was suffering from illness. It was simply unbearable. She had the feeling that Ines was devoting the whole day to confusing her. It even seemed to her that the girl had exchanged her soul with someone else. Sometimes she was as evil as if she were possessed by a demon. When she was young, she had threatened her with self-mutilation, though her mother had suggested that the girl only needed a makeover. That's all. Then she ignored her, and then the woman decided to teach her a lesson by knocking her out to put on better clothes. Even today, Ines stuffed her stomach with whatever she could find. What kind of noblewoman would behave like that? You couldn't say she wore makeup, and Carcel had seen her dressed with his own eyes. He couldn't believe his ears. A mother should help her daughter to be loved by her husband and not do anything to tarnish her reputation. But that day, Ines looked at her with such anger. From that moment on, her daughter's fate was no longer in her control, and so she entrusted her into the Lord's hands. Soon he would have to become her husband, and then the man would go to bed only with her. The woman began to laugh, for the one and only time Ines had managed to gain her approval was when she had made him hers by putting a chain around his neck while they were young. The Duchess was astonished, for they were only 6 years old at the time. It was when the Empress announced that they would have to marry Ines that he sobbed with fear. Such a thing is not likely to be forgotten. And the girl was different. She knew exactly what she was doing. That's why her mother saw the devil in her. Ines asked her fiancé's forgiveness for her own father's behavior, but it was all right because the Lord himself was aware of his own shortcomings. The girl felt guilty, therefore she asked the man not to pay attention to the words said by Leonel. Nevertheless, he had already done so. Carcel had even set the date of their wedding without any notification. Now, she would have to wear her mother's hideous 27-year-old dress. Of course, he was only doing what he thought was right. Ines merely wished to marry him, so she had no objections. She had been waiting for him for a long time, so this would be accepted with a smile. The Lord, on the other hand, knew her thoughts were not pure, but he was too good to be bound by any conventions, especially since she didn't want to see him languish under the burden of rules and obligations. It was one thing to compare a grown man to a flower, but Ines seemed to be brainwashing him now. But why would she do that? In his eyes, she spoke in a manner as if she sought to control his mind. So what were her intentions? He had already kissed her, so he made himself very clear. The protagonist explained that it was an effort to put a sense of duty in her head. Carcel was utterly outraged at the use of those words, as he had not pursued those goals. Ines said that she liked him, and afterwards stated the opposite. She said she didn't want to waste her powers, but she was actively pushing him to the edge of the cliff, as if she couldn't wait to get rid of him. Maybe she never liked the Lord at all, but hated him. The girl did not understand why he was so angry because it was Carcel who had made the choice in favor of a disorderly life. It seemed to her that his inability to understand was the result of relying solely on his body and neglecting the gray matter. Even now, he was still an idiot with a pretty face. He never missed an opportunity to mention his attractiveness. But Carcel, on the contrary, considered it his advantage. Moreover, the man was not at all eager to participate in this engagement. In this case, Ines released him from his obligations, and he promised that after the wedding everything would change. What made a man decide to turn into a saint After all, they would even have separate rooms. The girl was not going to lie down with the dogs, but Escalante argued since animals had to live among humans. Once again, he did not want to be released into the wilderness. Their lips made contact, causing both of them to blush. Carcel pointed out to her not to waste her strength simply, especially since it was becoming too dangerous. He ended up getting a slap on the wrist. Ines remained adamant, expressing neither joy nor anger. However, the slap came not to his face, but to his head. It might even seem from the blow that it wasn't the first time for her. The thought of it being his first time burdened her somewhat. He'd be surprised how many people existed who wanted to be spanked. Besides, dogs were supposed to run around outside, according to their upbringing. Animals should never be allowed to go into their master's room, let alone his bed. Since the beginning was started by a man, Ines herself decided to set some boundaries. After that would come the main part. These were the very basics, without which there was no way around it. In her opinion, if the couple wanted to please their families, there was no need to hold back. In any case, their wedding was a joke, and she would be in an old dress for the ceremony. Oh, and Carcel was a man who was floundering around trying to avoid his bride. Given the circumstances, Ines would have said he might have found the situation funny. That, however, was a lie. After all, he had always seen her as his wife, which was why the Lord had kissed her. Carcel apologized for his rudeness and carelessness, promising not to do anything she wouldn't like. All she had to do was ask for it. Ines was visibly nervous. However, the man would assume she was fine with everything, except for the kissing. And so the time flew by, and finally the wedding day arrived. To the ringing of the bells, the wedding melody rang out at the ceremony, and waiting for Ines at the altar was Carcel, who was truly blown away by her appearance. The color white suited her. A long eye contact kept the man in his thoughts until the couple took their vows and sealed their union with a kiss. A wedding ceremony imbued with an atmosphere of solemnity and piety, to which only the imperial family and 17 noble families were invited. Let this event could not be called large scale, but the participation in it was not regretted by any of the parties, for no matter what anyone said, the situation continued to remain quiet and calm. And everyone was stunned by the beauty of the protagonist. Carcel was approached by Ihar, who noticed how the man did not take his eyes off the newlywed. The man was known for his old-fashionedness, but in comparison to him, Escalante was a saint. Duke Valestena did his best to convey to him that there were enough other non-corrupt young men who could come to replace him as Ines' groom. Among them were Enrique Osorno, Leonardo Helves, and Ihar, who would never stray from the righteous path. At least he was considered so by others. Carcel was amused by the fact that he was actually one of the contenders, especially when the man had said rude things to the groom on his wedding day. However, Ihar only noted that they had made a mistake and would lose the bet, for now it was clear why Escalante couldn't take his eyes off Ines. He even had an idea that the guy would faint right in the middle of the ceremony. No one could believe their own eyes. Everyone thought that there was another daughter in the Valestina family that no one had ever heard of. Obviously, everyone was shocked. The girl kept getting a combination of surprised and admiring looks. She smiled good-naturedly at those who gazed at her in amazement, and ignored those who caused annoyance. Her behavior was natural, and in high society, Ines had always lorded it over the other nobles. But she was still herself. There was just a change in her hair and attire. Despite this, the world treated her as if everything about her had changed. Ihar doubted that it would be enough for the groom to be satisfied with just her, for novelty could be intoxicating. Moreover, even her body looked different. It was unexpected luck for Carcel. However, the man himself denied it since he had already seen it. Ihar had promised not to interfere with the fun, especially since he had no power. When Escalante got bored of the candy, Bouquet period, however, the cheeky man would wish to comfort his spouse. Even though they had seen it for themselves, they still couldn't believe that the woman dancing with Lieutenant Escalante was really the Ines Valestena they all knew. Carcel, however, told Iher that if he came to the conclusion that he was bored with life, he would simply have to tell the lieutenant, who would be more than happy to interrupt her. One way or the other, women grazed around him, which made it seem unfair to his interlocutor. The man was getting everything he wanted, and why couldn't he expect Ines to stay at home obediently? Besides, if the protagonist finds a lover, it will be much easier for Carcel to get rid of the eating guilt to the woman who has been in love with him since he was 6 years old. And there were many like Ihar. Escalante was approached by his cousin, who was chatting about the Valestena family's finest wine. He had previously been unable to refuse a single bottle even despite his pleas, but it seemed it was because of Carcel, who had become his brother-in-law, that they had to part ways after all. Oscar would have been easier to admit if the girl had favored Enrique Osorno. However, why did she choose Escalante? Even now, they looked great together. After all, as expected, Ines was gorgeous beyond belief. But what could an unmarried man like the Crown Prince know about marriage? He was having fun after all, as his consort was now having fun with another man. Oscar was already 27. Even after being rejected by Ines at the young age of 9, he had secretly continued his fruitless attempts at courting her. Eventually, it ended with him betrothed to the niece of the Marquis Barca, who was now coming out of the marriageable age, for she had turned 22. The prince refused to marry, citing her youth. He had only a few words with Ines, and the reason for this was simply that the refusal was too emphatic. So now the Crown Prince was constantly egging Carcel on to make him feel the same way. Though during their first dance, the main character's smile was quite normal. However, Oscar thought it was fake. This probably provoked Escalante, who drank from his wife's glass, which was unacceptable even for a prince. Suddenly, the talk was about Ihar, who, according to Oscar, will become bald like his father. However, he even gave Carcel advice and yes, to watch out for himself. The man joked that his interlocutor had a forehead like his father's, which made the Crown Prince very angry. Now he was curious if having the same shape meant that both of them would end up with similar hairlines. After a while, Ines felt hungry, but Juana had forbidden her to eat, as she might have a potbelly during her wedding night. If only that were the point. She'd had time to sample enough viands at the banquet. Even the Duke had taken a look at her, but she wouldn't be able to kill her daughter because she was now Escalante. The girl had changed so much. She had always said before that even socializing with other nobles was to her liking. Juana was talking about how everyone in the hall bulged their eyes at the lady as if they wanted a date with her. The Duke and Duchess were happy at first, but became more concerned afterward. They even wanted to hand out numbers to the men in line. They just thought that they were not interested in her, but in the art created by Juana's hands. The girl believed that her lady was always beautiful. People themselves were limited, especially young men. They even flirted with her openly, and the señoritas began to behave so friendly with the protagonist. Once upon a time, Ines too was limited, even to a greater extent than them. Although Juana didn't remember such a thing. Anyway, it could have been better because the girl didn't wear a single custom-made dress. Ines, on the other hand, wanted to maintain the easy atmosphere of the wedding. She'd never had the chance to take part in one after her first life, but even this small sample was enough to exhaust her. When the protagonist was living that life, every day was a pathetic attempt to survive, even if it seemed like a laughing matter at the time. But anger and despair were no laughing matter. Though now those memories had become rather hazy, one night had made them all worth it. But now Ines was all too aware of the situation she was in. She couldn't allow Carcel to be humiliated or looked down upon. After all, it was his first wedding. Throughout the marriage, she would not harm him in any way, nor would she shy away from her duties as a wife. The girl would not give him a single reason for divorce, and the rest of her plan should go off without a hitch. Now she was going to go to the bedroom. After all, this was just the beginning. The wedding ceremony and banquet were held solely for the amusement of others. The conclusion of the actual marriage contract, however, was coming to a close on the wedding night. In the aristocratic world, if nothing was accomplished on that very night, the next day the marriage could be simply annulled as if it had never taken place. And yet even a fully consummated marriage can turn into nothing if I do not comply with the conditions imposed by each of the parties. Of course, it didn't happen very often. All they wanted was for the wedding night to go smoothly. Besides, Carcel said that Ines still wanted this marriage. The Duke of Valistana kept threatening to annul it if any kind of interference arose, but was unable to realize this as long as his daughter wanted to keep the marriage alive. She tormented the bridegroom both in dreams and in reality, and his wishes seemed to have been suppressed at that time. Time dragged on painfully slowly, and when they saw Ines as he had imagined her, he thought Carcel would lose his senses. And so he prayed that the night would pass quickly, and the world would be as orderly as his dreams. Ines Escalante's name would be added to the Escalante family tree, and Carcel would take her away from the Duke to a place where they could be alone, to a new mansion on the coast of Calstella. He didn't believe this day would come, but here it was. Without a doubt, the boy thought himself distraught. At the moment of sending the marriage proposal, he decided that they would spend their honeymoon not in Mendoza or Esposo, but in Calstella, where his fleet was moored. Carcel swore that it didn't make much difference at all, and the reason was certainly not because he was desperate to be alone with her. Perhaps the man had fallen in love with Ines after all. Could it be that he was now in love with Ines? People were discussing the woman who had become the wife of the arrogant Escalante. She looked particularly seductive, and they wanted to find a way to seduce her. Ines Valistana's beauty exceeded everyone's expectations, but she would not, in their opinion, be able to sustain Escalante's interest for long. And now they couldn't wait for him to turn his own back on her. There was nothing easier than comforting a woman with a wounded heart. She appeared in a room that was filled with darkness, but even so, the rustle of her dress filled the space, echoing in their ears. Both their hearts were pounding like mad. Carcel had feared she had come all this way in this form. That turned out to be true, and Ines even added that there had always been something of the exhibitionist in her. It was a joke, though. The protagonist would invite him into bed and make the first move by skipping the strap of her nightgown. They would have to undress one way or another. She was only trying to make it easier for him. Did he need help getting undressed? Ines had heard that some people like to stay in their clothes, so she didn't mind putting her clothes back on. Though, Carcel stopped her, asking her not to do such a thing in front of him. He picked her up in his arms, showering her with compliments. The man decided to help her since she had used up so much energy on those guests. Ines, on the other hand, was trying to guess why her husband reacted the way he did. After all, she had only shed some clothes. The calm sea, the sun rising over the forest, the campfire in front of the cabin. She wanted to think of nothing but peaceful things. After all, this marriage had been planned by her, and their wedding night was an integral part of that plan. Ines was now mentally prepared and convinced that soon enough Carcel would fall asleep. It was nothing. But still, for some reason, the man was in no hurry, and her face spoke as if the girl had entered the battlefield. She was only trying to remind him of his duty, calling him even in bed Escalante. It was only a habit, though. After all, Ines would now also carry this surname, and if she also continued to call her husband, it would be hard to tell whether the protagonist was doing it to him or to Miguel. Mentally, she didn't understand his speeches at all, as he was well put together. This is quite normal, and yet Ines didn't expect her husband to turn out to be that big. Carcel had asked her to shout his name when she felt good, so that everyone outside could hear it. However, kissing on the lips was forbidden, so he started with her neck. That wasn't the point, though. It seemed he would now have to heel her from head to toe to get a grasp on what it wasn't allowed for. She was enjoying it, though, which made her skin goosebumps. Except The man wasn't even doing anything strange yet. Ines begged him not to do that, but only to try to make her feel good. He wanted to know what she enjoyed and what she didn't, so that he would remember. And again, Ines began to speak the same words about not wanting this marriage. It was he who had sent the marriage proposal, even suddenly made a demand to her father to hand her over within a fortnight, and the Duke had showered him with curses. It was the marriage that Carcel ultimately desired. Whether they liked each other or not did not matter now. Both desired this marriage, and that was the reality of their marriage. And Ines still tried hard not to recognize it, for she had a habit of controlling the man, making the excuse that the marriage was desired solely by her. But Carcel wanted her whole, including her bad habits. Still, he was quite fond of bad women. If her sole purpose was to get pregnant, there was no need for anything else. That was true. He was fine with that. However, Ines was now telling him to take her like an animal, to take her against her will without regard for her feelings at all, except that the heroine had already given her consent to everything. But Carcel kept pulling words out of her that she didn't want him because she found him dirty. It would have been easier for him to accept if Ines just wanted to end it quickly, because she would rather not go to bed with a libertine like him. She was pure of body, to the point where there would be nothing to say to him. Still, the girl wished they could get along, to live peacefully, so Carcel could do with her as he pleased. And since the man couldn't cover his ears, he wanted to at least cover her lips. But he had no right to kiss those lips, no right to be angry, or even to want to find out about her hidden past. The isolated girl lay with the guy who was the only exception in her life, and the guy felt sorry for her and showed interest. She had once captivated him, and Carcel felt the satisfaction of believing that perhaps he was the whole world to her. Now, there was a feeling that this was becoming dust. The Duchess, on the other hand, could not believe that the day had come at last. Yesterday's events seemed so unreal that it seemed like a dream to her. A huge burden had finally been lifted. She wondered what she had done wrong to deserve this shame. Ines was finally a woman. Her mother worried that she would wear those hideous black rags for the rest of her life. The Duke asked Olga to stop, but now her tears even began to flow from happiness. She would have preferred to send her daughter to a convent, so as not to bring shame on the family name. The woman was not worried about how Ines herself might have reacted. However, Carcel stood up for her, who threatened to follow the example of his wife and also ignore Olga. The true concern came from love, so if she truly loved her daughter, she would be more afraid of hurting her, not that her words would be ignored. They had a long journey ahead of them to Kalstala, so the man apologized for not being able to stay longer. And a look of surprise appeared on his parents' faces, but not a pleasant one.